Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this now fourth and final session of the ESPON Territorial Research Conference on New Research Avenues for Territorial Development and Cohesion in Europe. My name is Roland Gaugitsch, Senior Policy Analyst in the field of Territorial Analysis and Cohesion Policy at OIR, the Austrian Institute for Regional Studies. I have the pleasure of now guiding you through this final session as your moderator. So today's event is about exploring new methods, new approaches, and innovative ideas to support territorial development and cohesion. In our final session today, we want to focus on the invisible in Europe, aspects of inequalities which remain hidden from traditional data collections and subsequently from traditional policymaking approaches. In our format, we're bringing together researchers and policymakers to exchange knowledge, share experience, and find solutions that work. And like in the previous sessions, we would also like to engage with you, our remote audience, during the session. We want to hear your thoughts and involve you in the conversation and answer your questions. During the session, you will be able to take part in polls and send your questions and comments on Slido, either by accessing via the QR code on screen right now or by going to sli.do in your browser and entering the code ESPON. So on to our session. Much of what shapes people's lives in Europe's territories, how they access services, how they use public space, or how they belong to a community, oftentimes remains invisible in conventional policymaking and planning. Traditional approaches we apply often rely on aggregated data, on fixed administrative boundaries, as we've heard in previous sessions, and on sectoral lenses that overlook the nuanced realities and inequalities. The methods we apply tend to favor what is easily measurable and what aligns with existing institutional templates, but they miss what is outside of those boundaries. Yet this invisibility of specific aspects is not random. Across the domains, whether social, ecological, or specific aspects like demographic development, we see common causes for it. Insufficiently disaggregated data, limited cross-sectoral integration, and planning cultures that oftentimes prioritize technical knowledge and technical approaches over individual experiences. As a result, key aspects of inequality remain often unaccounted for. And this not only distorts our understanding of territorial dynamics, but it also limits the effectiveness and potentially the democratic legitimization of our policy interventions. To address this, we need methods that do more than analyze. They must make structural imbalances visible, systemic dependencies tangible, and overlooked experiences legible to decision makers. In today's sessions, we explore precisely such methods, those that not only expose what has been overlooked, but also open up new ways of acting upon this territorial inequality. And our speakers will show us 3 examples of how such invisible things have been made visible in their research, building on real-world applications from case studies in Milan, Navarra, and the Marche region. As our first speaker today, we welcome Benedetta Brun, an urban planner who holds a PhD in urban planning design and policy. In her research, she focuses on gender inequalities in urban environments and the access of women to public spaces. Besides her academic experience, she has also worked in applied urban planning on strategies ensuring sustainable development and community benefit in mountain areas. In her presentation today, she will introduce us to an innovative approach for participatory creation of indicators to enrich spatial data and support gender-sensitive policymaking.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone.
As our second speaker, we have Matteo Giacomelli, a planner and environmental scientist currently working at Politecnico di Milano. He holds a degree in environmental studies from Aalborg University and a PhD in sustainable urban planning from the University of Camerino. In his research, he explores the topics of landscape ecology and regional development, blending theoretical insights with practical applications. And today he will show us how the traditional focus of cohesion policies on socio-economic indicators falls short to capture important ecological aspects, and proposes an innovative approach for integrating socio-ecological aspects into policy design.
Hi.
And finally, as our third speaker, we welcome Andrea Celico, an applied economist and policy analyst specializing in institutional and political economy. He holds a PhD in applied economics from the University of Navarra and currently works at the Observatorio Territorial de Navarra, where he develops data-driven tools to analyze and evaluate public policies aligned with the EU's rural vision. He will present today a framework to address rural depopulation in policymaking, building on quantitative techniques, combining modeling with mapping approaches.
Thank you.
Now, before we start our presentation, as in the previous sessions, we would like to ask a question to you, our audience. So we would like to know which data-related barriers have you experienced when analyzing territorial disparities? Please go to Slido and provide your answers. Now on to our first speaker, Benedetta. Your work is somewhat, say, revolutionary in urban planning, and I can imagine there are quite some challenges in implementation. How do policymakers respond when you introduce them to these approaches and these non-traditional forms of data?
Yeah, well, of course, I'm part of a bigger research group, so I'm not working myself, luckily, and this kind of helps, of course. I'm working in tandem with other researchers, and the principal one is Carolina Pacchi, and we always address this issue together, so when I go and speak with policymakers, I'm not by myself. And we also recall knowledge that comes from a bigger group of studies and lecture, of course, and scholars, which is the one of gender planning, which is kind of new. It's from the 1970s, more or less, that's been going on. And the principal focus is, of our research at least, is on gender data gap. So if we think about urban planning, and we need to go back a bit in history, urban planning at the beginning of its, at its beginning, which we can trace back more or less at during the Industrial Revolution, was thought to be a theoretical science that was based on mathematical laws and strict analysis. So planners were seen as some sort of superheroes and super partes that knew all the problem and also all the solution that the city needed at the time. But what we know now is that basically they didn't know, they had just a strict point of view. And the thing they were representing were their way of looking at the world. So what they did perform was a marginal analysis of the context. And what we have now is some sort of the daughter and son of this way of thinking. So we still don't have, and we still do not collect gender disaggregated data. And there's a huge data gap, of course. If we think now, policies are instructed by data and not having an idea of how, minorities, gender minorities, but especially how impacts of the city are different for men and women doesn't really help when we design policies, especially in the urban context and in the urban sector. And I really like this graph because it kind of represents well how this gender data gap could impact in a different way men and women, especially if we think about issues like mobility or access to tenure or also climate resilience, which of course has different impact based on gender we belong to. And I want to focus for 1 second to the toilet problem, which is kind of fun because I believe that every women in the audience has experienced that somehow, that when you go into public spaces, toilet for women always have some sort of line. And that's because we still believe that we have to divide space in the same way for men and women. But that's not it. We have different needs and we have different way of using the space, and toilet is just a small representation of the issue, of course. So the absence of gender data gap in the policy making, it's real and it's tangible. So thank you. If we follow another problem about gender data gap and generally speak about gender policies is also the fact that space is not considered as an important element when we address social issues. So we believe space is something in the background that doesn't really impact how we behave and how we interact with others, while it's not the case. Space is the representation of the society, of power relations, and also on how we understand gender stereotypes. So we design space using our preconceived notion of society, and in that space in which we all belong and we all interact, basically we keep performing the same interaction between men and women and also between people. And of course, it doesn't help us evolve or try to dismantle this way of thinking and this way of interacting. And I really like the idea that Foucault and Leonie Sandercock brought into city planning, which is that the urban environment has privileged specific practices and specific way of what is considered important and what need to study. And this recalls what we were speaking about just before, so like the absence of gender data. So if we then think of the space in a different way, we could see how the place-making process is actually derives from the people shaping the place, so how we design it and how we perform it, but also in this dynamic relationship, how space shapes how we can act and interact between one another, so our identity. So it's really important, the role that space has in the definition of ourselves as well. And I think that in this sense, to move beyond this reductive approach and how we understand the city and how we study the city especially, it's really crucial to adopt an intersectional analysis. And intersectionality stresses the importance of looking at those that belong basically to the intersection of inequalities. So, for example, black women that suffer at the same time the discrimination for being black or being women. And of course, which effects do they produce? So what we are trying to do right now in the city of Milan is an analysis that upholds this intersectional idea of looking at space and how discrimination is geographically distributed along the city. We use some data that are available right now, but of course they are not complete and we cannot think that's enough. But that's what we have. So we, on the top line, we start doing an analysis using the data that are available from the municipality of Milan. And we started looking at both where are the principal places where the majority of care is needed, thinking also of that women uphold the majority of share, the share of care work. So that's something that impacts their life quite often. Which are the nuclear family and how they are composed. So where, for example, women with children live. But we also use some data coming from the Italian Institute of Statistics, which are a bit more detailed to see which level of education they hold, also where they work, if they work, if they are Italians or not. So we try to make it a bit more complex, the overall analysis of the space, to see in which area we see a convergence of elements that could, of course, create a more complex reality and uphold more barriers for those kind of women. And what we understood doing this research so far is that we don't have enough data to describe such a complex reality, so we definitely need more information about it, but also that we need new indicators. So we don't have enough indicators to describe this complex reality. We are developing new ones, but it's quite hard, of course, because we don't have the data, and data haven't been collected so far in this intersectional way. So, and this, of course, we are speaking about gender difference between men and women. We have no information in Italy, at least, about gender minorities. So it's really hard. It's even harder if we think in that sense. And the last thing is that I wanted to stress is data are really important, but we cannot think to analyze reality just based on data. Of course, the body and the embodied experience upholds a crucial role in understanding urban planning and urban realities, especially if we think about that we, with our body, create communities and how, as we said before, these communities shape places. And I really like this image because we kind of move from technocratic imagination of how the city works and how planning works to then the more complex nuclear cell that's the population and how they move inside the space and how they perform the space and also how they shape this space. So embodiment and work with the population, it's crucial if we want to move forward and if we want to move beyond this oversimplification of the urban space. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can agree. I really like the last picture, and I also really liked the very plastic example, because it's an obvious everyday experience that all of us know, but maybe don't connect it immediately with this kind of space and distribution of space questions. So really interesting to see how this kind of lack of data, lack of awareness of a specific issue leads to actual injustice in practice. Yeah. So thanks for this presentation. We are moving now to another field where lack of data and awareness creates injustice in a sense, namely the ecological field. Matteo, you have analyzed kind of urban-rural interrelations and ecological flows, basically. What have you found are the most relevant differences when we apply a socio-ecologic perspective instead of a socio-economic perspective, which we very often do?
Thank you, Roland. Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here. My presentation or my research is strictly related to the issue of the future of rural territories. So the big question or issue that we raised since 50, 70 years of what is the destiny of areas which are far from urban poles or cities. Those areas that are called, we have been calling today inland areas. To answer this question, we have in Europe a very precious concept that is the one of territorial cohesion. Territorial cohesion is one of the pillars of European Union, and is kind of represents also the identity of the Union. It was conceptualized to, let's say, look at disparities between regions and within regions in order to support less advantaged territories. This concept is applied in several foundings. We have structural foundings such as cohesion policies, but also other. But very interesting, there was also an application in Italian context, which is called the National Strategy for Inland Areas. And this was developed during the Barca Ministry of Cohesion. It was 2014. And basically, they mapped the whole Italy following the municipal unit according to the distance from services. So from basic services considered important to leave a place. So we're talking about schools, we're talking about hospitals or train stations. And my question or my research is based on the question that what about looking at the territory from another perspective, from an ecological perspective, so looking at services that are supplied from nature to society. That's where start my theoretical framework, that is the framework of landscape as social ecological systems. This is something that is rising attention in research because it's a precious definition to read landscape as intersection or interrelationship between social and natural systems. So we see on one side the objective of this relation, so the objectivity of landscape, which it is shaped by centuries of this relation, but on the other side we look at also the perception of this. So we have a subjective lens on this interrelation. And well, what the graph is representing is also this complexity. That on one side is what it is, and on the other side is also what is perceived. And to read this connection, my research applies the tool of ecosystem services, which is also raising also in policy making because of this simplicity. So ecosystem services are just overall the benefits that society derive from nature. And they include all this variety of cultural provisioning or regulating aspects that are vital for our society. Well, in my study design, I applied the topics of supply and demand of service. So on one side, I look at areas which are able to supply a service. On the other one, what is demanding, areas which are demanding for services. And this is, of course, done through indicators. I try to read this phenomenon through a specific feature connected to the municipal unit. And on one side, trying to cluster them through the ecosystem service bundling technique. So as you see, getting to a sort of new landscape unit, so a functional unit showing the characteristic of a place. And on the other side, through what is called budgeting. So doing, what if we do supply minus demand in a place? So, and then we can see probably disparities in this service provision or service dynamics. So next, we see the application of this study, which is Le Marche region, as you mentioned before. And I believe it's an interesting case study because it's a Mediterranean region, it's on the Adriatic coast, and on one side, I just push forward, and on one side you see the Adriatic side that is strongly anthropized, so more urbanized, and then a gradient going toward the inland, which there is strictly related to the Apennines, which are the oldest mountain chain in Italy. So so applying this framework on the case study of Le Marche, you see down the result is showing a strong hotspot of supply related to the inland, while on the coast there is a strong demand. So already from this picture we see how there is an imbalance on these services, right? There is an area which is clearly benefiting from this, and an area which is providing these services then. Then here we see the results of the bundling exercise, which is shaping clearly certain landscape unit, what I called. So going from the coast, so this urban coastal bundle, toward the inland where you have this forested bundle, which is then you see on the graphs in the bottom, which is mostly delivering cultural and regulating services. This interdependency can be seen when doing the budgeting exercise. So going directly to read, for example, in regulating services, what are the areas that are mostly providing and what are the areas mostly benefiting from them. And we see a clear gradient going from the urban coast to the inland, with the urban being in a negative budget for both regulating, providing, and cultural service, and the inland being having a surplus. So this what can tell us in terms of policy. So first of all, we have to recognize this clear imbalance that we have, and in this sense, recognizing urban poles for what they receive, so that somehow the development that cities had in the last centuries or years was also allowed thanks to these benefits that they received from the rest of the territories. And on the other side, we should be able to support inland for this support that they give to the whole society. And this must be done including the social systems that characterize this area. Also because of the concept of co-production, which means that ecosystem services are not simply derived from nature, but there is always a gradient of work from people to supply it. So that's what we bring home from this study, that cohesion policies can include ecological aspect and can tackle the complexity of this system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, especially again the last slide and the balances basically that make really like visual and tangible what these gradients represent, and how this, if we call it injustice, but it's simply something that might require better balancing, to have rural areas benefit fairly in comparison to others. Thanks for that. With our next presentation, we are going to stay basically in rural areas and focus on a specific aspect that was also raised in previous sessions today, namely depopulation is one of the key challenges for them, and a challenge that requires a response. In the previous session, we've also heard it's not about turning everything around, but it's sometimes simply about reducing the negative effects. So, Andrea, you are presenting a model that spans basically all phases of policy making, from diagnostics to planning, monitoring, and ultimately evaluation to address those challenges. Please.
That's right. Thank you, Roland. So basically, the work I'm introducing today, it is a combination of territorial analysis and policy design and implementation in a framework to try to counter rural depopulation in the case of Navarra. There have been, of course, multiple challenges in its development, so I will try to reduce them today. But let me just mention that the project is carried out as part of the official political strategy to counter depopulation in Navarra, led by the government of Navarra. In that context, my department is contributing to the technical and analytical guidance. So to give some context about depopulation, we know that rural depopulation is not just a demographic issue. It is very cross-cutting, transversal, and can entail multiple dimensions. And in that sense, we can relate to what Matteo has mentioned about complexity of this type of territorial cohesion problems. And in Europe, it poses, of course, a lot of structural challenges that we observe in our daily lives. But luckily, this is being increasingly addressed at different institutional levels. So, for instance, at the European Union level, we have initiatives like the EU's long-term vision for rural areas. We have, at the national level, at least in Spain, the government is currently working on developing a new political strategy to counter depopulation. And at the regional level, where we are working at, in 2023, the government of Navarra approved a dedicated strategy to counter this growing concern, with the expression of a clear political commitment to act in that direction. So, might have clicker. So, in order to give you, in order to give you context about Navarra, Navarra is a quite small region in the north of Spain, which is characterized by a terraneous mountain, a handful of urban centers, and then a mosaic of small population settlements dispersed across the territory. And despite being one of the richest areas of Spain by GDP per capita and having an overall increasing demography, it is experiencing really strong rural to urban polarization, with urban centers that are growing and rural areas which are being increasingly abandoned. So the strategy, so basically the government decides to take action in this respect and develops this strategy that was meant to be a participatory process involving different actors, from local stakeholders such as institutions, residents, municipalities, and the regional public administration, including even some research institutions. And the main goal is to create the economic, social, territorial conditions in order to try to maintain the population, improving quality of life of residents, or even to attract new population to the most vulnerable areas. So the strategy does a really good job because it recognizes the importance of understanding the territory. So it starts with a phase of territorial analysis where what where a preliminary step was to try to map the municipalities' vulnerability to rural depopulation based on demographic indicators, and this is what you're seeing in the visualization. So based on that map, we can already understand that there are some problems related to remoteness, to accessibility. And I think that the most important added value of the strategy is that it recognizes the cross-cutting nature of depopulation. It doesn't stick just to the demographic aspect of it, but it calls for an analytical approach that goes beyond demography, and in particular identifies 4 areas of intervention. So of course, demographic one, then the economic, the social relationships, so community, and the services on the territory. So in order to take action in these 4 areas, it defines a 2-level governance framework where on top we have the regional government and public administration, and at the bottom there is a set of local stakeholders. Now, the idea is to have in between these 2 actors a evidence-based platform for strategic policy design and implementation, which will aid in the creation of informative loops, so which will aid the exchange of insights, place-based insights between these 2 actors in order to better tailor the actions to take on the territory. So this is where our work comes in, and this is what we have been working on. So on the development of these 4 phases, which go from diagnostic to planning, monitoring, and evaluation. The diagnostic, so this first phase, it is about developing basically a data-based diagnostic platform. So in order to identify the main vulnerabilities of each municipality, of each territory. And how do we do that? We take inspiration from the literature on quality of life indicators, and we try to integrate traditional statistics by using new technologies such as remote sensing, such as spatial data analysis and big data analytics, in order to collect a wide variety of indicators, which eventually are aggregated and combined to obtain synthetic indicators, which will allow to proxy the exposure of each territory to this problem. So basically we have 4 synthetic indicators, one for each of the dimension addressed by the political strategy, so the economy, demography, services, and social relationships, and a composite indicator that tries to summarize overall vulnerability. Just by looking at these maps that I'm showing, you can observe some emerging patterns, without going into the technical details, but we can observe a strong urban versus rural demographic divide. We can observe a north versus south economic cleavage. We can observe problems of services accessibility. But what is probably most important is that we observe a wide heterogeneity across even neighboring small territories, meaning that each territory is facing some specific vulnerabilities and necessities which call for a really granular and fine-tuned action in terms of policy implementation. Now, the idea is that we bring the insights from the diagnostic into the phase of planning in order to turn basically diagnosis into action. The idea is that these insights can help the policymaker to better design policymaker specifically for each one of those territory, being those fiscal incentives, being those the implementation of specific programs on the territory. Then in the third phase, where we have the monitoring, the idea is to give the policymaker basically a sort of dashboard, a checklist of all the actions which are necessary in order for a successful implementation of the overall policy that has been planned. And finally, the evaluation, which personally I believe it is probably it is probably the most important phase, because it's related to to political trust and to accountability, legitimacy of the policies which are being implemented, here the idea is to use the data that we have collected, the insights that we have obtained, in order to check whether the policies implemented are actually and effectively improving quality of life of individuals. Are they actually trying to stabilize or reverse depopulation? And of course, that involves using quantitative methods, qualitative methods, comparative benchmarkings. So overall, in order to conclude, I would say that this four phases approach, of course, has many challenges and limitations. Availability of data at very granular level and disaggregated data is one of the challenges that also the others have mentioned. Methodologies, they are never neutral, so use of different methodologies can imply different conclusions, so we have to be really transparent and careful with that. And finally, evaluation capacity, of course, requires technical skills, but also requires a sort of institutional culture where accountability and transparency are seen as an opportunity for better policymaking and not just as a threat to the policymaker. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for this. I like quite a lot how we even link across the different sections that we had today. The inner areas are addressed in several cases. The big data approaches are relevant to the very different sectoral topics as well. So that shows really how integrated we have to understand those things. All of your presentations showed very clearly that you have an interest in a specific topic, and you try whatever is possible to depict the realities that we have here by using proxy indicators, by calculating synthetic indicators, and so on and so on. And this shows that whatever is the kind of the region, whatever is the thematic context, inequalities are real and they are a challenge, and if we do not address them, we miss kind of a very crucial aspect of reality. But to address them, we need to see them, and we don't have the full picture yet, I would say. This also resonates very well with the results of our poll from the audience, which has identified as the key barrier for analyzing territorial disparities the lack of high-resolution data, and as a second main point, the kind of limited understanding of data by policymakers or other local actors. Linked to that, I would like to know, we have a lack of high-resolution data. We on this table fully agree on that, but apparently it's not as obvious to other people always. So how can we kind of improve the understanding that there are those hidden realities and hidden inequalities? And maybe also outside of your research, what do you consider are kind of the inequalities that we are most likely to miss with those existing spatial data and spatial frameworks that we have?
I can start.
Please.
So I think that what we are missing now, or at least what we risk to miss, is what probably Kimberly Crenshaw would say, like people that live at the intersection of inequalities. So the one that we were speaking about before, which is either for gender issues or for other issues, could be ethnicity or class, or also like physical abilities. So like we have so many inequalities that's kind of hard to tell. So like we risk to miss those that are already at the margin, so that we are not considering in our current policies. But if we think on a broader sense, before we were speaking about cross-cutting issues and like the agenda of SDGs. So like in that case, if we look at like SDGs specifically related to, of course, like gender issues, we have an SDGs, which is the number 5, but we don't have gender disaggregated data or gender related data at all in any other SDGs. So if we look at SDGs number 11, which is the one about urban development, we don't know how the indexes that we are measuring right now are impacting in a different way men and women, which is kind of a problem. And we are just speaking about men and women. Again, we are not considering gender minorities, which is a problem per se. Mm-hmm. But we are doing the bare minimum, let's say. And also, in that case, we are failing to report what's happening in our cities, and we cannot imagine a sustainable development that doesn't consider all the population that lives in contemporary cities.
Mm-hmm. So we kind of miss this cross-cutting aspects. You talk about gender from one perspective, but I guess it's also for all other aspects that cross-cutting elements are what are missing the most, probably.
Yeah, I believe that it's also related to the reductionist approach that indicator or let's say territorial action has, that tend to reduce the complexity of an issue on a single sector, on a single issue. For example, when we work with territories or local systems, I think it's very important to be able to include the cultural aspects of what you work with, because when we talk about transformative process or big challenges that we have to fight as Europe or as in a global approach, it's very important to see them as cultural process, so that it's if we take, for example, climate change or other issues, I think it's not about finding the norm, but really being able to support a process that make people understand what is the reason and why we have to go in that direction.
That's true. Would you also like to?
Both of you have mentioned the importance of complexity when it comes to having some of these territorial inequalities not clearly captured. So beyond the complexity itself, I think that also part of the challenge lies in what are the instruments that we are using to capture those inequalities. And what I mean here, it is very much related to how we collect, structure, and interpret data. So if we think about spatial data frameworks, spatial data, they are very closely tied to the definition of administrative boundaries. And of course, this makes data easier to manage, but on the other side, it can lead to a partial representation of realities, because those inequalities occurring within those administrative units might be just invisible, as you said, Roland. So just to give an example, in our context, Navarra, many municipalities are composed by multiple very small and very dispersed population centers. But of course, if we work at the municipal level, all that heterogeneity is going to be missed by municipal averages. So and another important element is also related to the time structure of data. Data often come with significant delay, or they might be even static. So it is really important to try to improve on these technical aspects related to how we carry on our analysis. And finally, something that also Matteo mentioned is related to the importance of qualitative insights. Many of the issues that we face in territorial cohesion are related to social issues, and that is about individuals' perception, individuals' beliefs, which are aspects that are really difficult to be captured by traditional indicators. So we should not forget the importance of on-the-field work, talking to people with surveys and focus groups and work of the kind.
Yeah, I think that's something we also addressed in a discussion before. Kind of we rely, or we think it's very reliable when we have very technical results, but sometimes that's not the full picture, and the experience on the ground knowledge maybe is more valuable, or it brings at least an additional perspective to the quantitative insights that we have. You have mentioned that kind of administrative boundaries, and we lack kind of information about inner regional disparities. Then, of course, there are some aspects which we might probably not be able to overcome simply because statistical systems are set up in a way that they collect up until the municipality or up until the region, but not further than that. But on the other hand, we also have, for example, economic data, labor market data that is disaggregated down to grid cells of 100 meters. So sometimes we do put the effort in to go very much beyond administrative boundaries, very much into detail. I sense a little bit from your presentations as well that there seems to be kind of a lack of interest sometimes to go that far. And I'm wondering what's the reason for this? Why is there little interest in making these aspects visible?
That's like a complex question. I don't think like it's something that's premeditated. So we cannot define one unique problem or reason behind this behind this issue. It's more what you were saying, Matteo, like it's more a cultural thing. So we are studying what we think is important, what we think is relevant for our development. I think it could be applied for all the three topics that we've been discussing today. So we are not challenging the word. We are keep like the same framework that we've been using so far. So the data we collect represent this idea of looking at the word, and of course, we can read this same issue when we think about algorithms. So if we feed the algorithm with this biased data, the result we will have from them will be biased as well, because we are keep repeating the same stereotypes that we have in our mind. So we are not trying to describe a different reality. We just stick to what we know, and I think that a problem that we can just overcome by start questioning the world we live in and deconstruct our preconceived notion of how we should be in the world and how we should behave.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, this is true. If I can add, I think what you can see, it's also a spatial dimension in this interest that you have, because at the beginning I mentioned the rise of the urban areas comparing to the rest of the territories, right? Especially. Well, in many countries in Europe, I think we used to have these important communes and small centers spread throughout the territory. This tendency of this demographic tendency of the population toward the cities is bringing also restructuring the political context, in the sense that today the political power is very much related to urban centers, and for this reason I think there might be also, it's maybe not an interest, but a tendency to look at data and to look for data from an urban perspective. That's why in this sense that the way you look for data then is shaping what are the results.
But why do we start with this? What's the?
Because the fact that we often talk about the power of data. I think also behind data, behind the choice to look for that indicator, I think there is a decision somehow. So. Yeah, and this decision might be related to non-technical issues, I would say.
Right. So, well, personally, I don't believe that there is little interest in keeping some territorial inequalities invisible. I think that might be due to a combination of both methodological and institutional reasons. So on one side we have methods and data availability that might not be 100% adapt to capture the degree of complexity that we observe on the territory, and on the other side we have institutions which by definition might follow the path of least resistance, so to call it. meaning that the policymakers sometimes might fall back on the easiest solution because it is the easiest one to fit within a political cycle. It is the easiest one to fund or to explain to the electorate. However, if you think about these two tendencies, they might be mutually and self-reinforcing, leading to a sort of policy blind spot where some of these inequalities remain invisible. So, for instance, if the rural necessities are not well captured in the data because of our limitations, in turn, they will not appear in the analysis that we provide policymaker, and in turn, it will be much more difficult for the policymaker to prioritize this type of interventions. And as you were saying, that can reinforce this tendency that we observe in the political debate, where main populations that there is receive most attention, and their necessities receive more attention.
Yeah. If I can add just
Please.
one other thing, is also that we cannot think of policies as one size fits all kind of policies. So they're kind of doomed to fail, of course, because we do not recognize the specificity of each territory, but also of the problems they are facing. So it's really relevant. And we can see that a lot in gender policies, which are quite broad in a sense. So they are trying to address an issue without really questioning it and keeping always the same structure of the problem. So it's also how we frame the problems we are addressing. I think that's quite relevant in the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. It's quite a well, I always have the quote of a friend of mine who's a statistician in my head, who, when I asked him for my specific topic on cross-border dynamics, why don't you collect data? And his answer was, as soon as someone tells me to do it, I do it, but I'm an institution and I do what I'm told, not what I want. So there is a need to realize there is this issue, and we could overcome it with data. I think that's one of the key points. Thank you very much. I would put your attention towards the questions we have received from the audience, and I would maybe start with the first one. I think is quite clearly addressed to you. So are there any best practice examples that have established an interdisciplinary feminist approach to urban spatial planning, if you're aware?
Yeah, sure. Well, there are several. As I said before, it's a topic that's been going on since the 70s, more or less. So nowadays we have some projects that have been developed. I think Europe, in that sense, is one of the most relevant place to be, because we have been, every country has been developing a specific strategy. We have the gender mainstreaming approach since 1996, which is one of the principal policies that address gender issues. So this policy has been implemented in each country. And the most relevant one, I think we can mention two. One is Austria, that has developed a specific plan for their city on how to introduce gender topics, and they've developed specific neighborhoods keeping in mind these elements. But my personal favorite one is Barcelona, so Spain. Spain has a really strict gender policies framework. They have implemented during the years several elements, and Barcelona especially has developed a new project, which is from 2015, which is the one of Superillas, thanks to Ada Colau, which was the previous mayor of the city. And they're developing these new spaces for citizens, where they basically removed all the cars and all the accessibility issues they had, and developed new neighborhood for the neighbors. So they also work in tandem with the population, which is of course crucial, as we said several times today, so to involve population in both the itinere, ex ante and ex post analysis of the project. So I think this could be two relevant examples.
Thank you very much. I hope we answered satisfactory then the question. Then I would like to move to the second one, and I think it's again what very much addressed to you, and maybe also to your approach, that the question is, the presentations rely heavily on indicator combinations, but can these be used at higher levels than local ones?
Yeah. Well, sure. The answer for me is, of course, that is probably something technically even easier to do. Usually our problem is to go more granular rather than going at a higher level of aggregation. I believe that what is important is that these different levels of observation that we have with data are used as complementary. So it is important, of course, to have very granular approaches, but we should never forget the whole picture, which can be given by higher level of data aggregation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I agree. Like, I think at least, like in my case, this is kind of a methodology and indexes that could be used also on a broader scale. And as in the case of Milan, of course, and I think in general, cities are not some sort of island that float around without anything around it. But of course, they heavily rely on what's on the suburbs, on other small cities around. So there's kind of a huge interrelation between different spaces. So it would be, I think, super important doing what Andrea was mentioning before. So to see which are the relationships that exist between places.
Okay, so that's one way until statisticians provide us what we need to address it in the meantime. Matteo, you want to add something to the last point, or?
Yeah, I mean, in respect to my research, probably. I think in that case, it has to do with scalability also of the method, in the sense that even though the framework I use, it's a complex framework in the sense that you look at landscape and all the interaction that this brings. My methods are simplifying in the sense that I'm using a tool which is a common tool now, the one of ecosystem services, in many even land use plans, biodiversity conservation practices, and so on. So I think it's already embedded in many contexts. So it's just about deciding to make this bridge and use it also in contexts where normally nature is not taken into account.
You mentioned scalability, and that's I think quite an important point that I also wanted to ask for your approaches. You have presented cases, basically. All of you have presented something that is linked to a specific territory that is maybe currently more in a case study phase, I would say, which is of course a very important starting point. But how can we then make sure and really support that these kind of methods, these kind of approaches are taken up outside of those cases as well?
Yeah. I think it's something like that at least urban planners wonder every day. I believe that the only answer to this question is literacy. So if you want to have an impact on the production of space and the development of new typology of space, is to create knowledge, not only for yourself, but for policymakers and for people that work in institutions, so that they can adopt your point of view and also understanding what you've been doing so far. And if you produce knowledge and share the knowledge with people that make decisions, I think that's the only way also, because I think every topic that we've discussed so far they're heavily relating on political will and political decisions. So it would be crucial to have people that actually work beside the political will of the time, and so to keep seeing a long-lasting change. And if I can add small things on gender topics, I think it would be crucial also to start teaching to young folks and young children about this topic from an early age, so that it would be much easier to frame these issues as important issues and not only topics that are concerning women, although women represent 50% of the population, but as relevant ones that actually involve everyone and not just women.
Right, like this question that you posed about scalability, I think, is fundamental, because we don't want these instruments, this innovation, just to stay as pilots in academic, settings. We want this to be implemented and to have an impact. So, what I was reflecting on is that on one side there is a growing demand for territorial and place-based policies, which are, based on evidence, on data. And in this context, we have technologies such as GIS, remote sensing, big data analytics, what I mentioned today, which I wouldn't say they are experimental anymore. They are quite mature from a technological point of view, and so they could represent a big opportunity for better fine-tuning policies to the territory. However, and it is key, despite this maturity, oftentimes when it comes to implementation, we find that there is resistance to their implementation in policy settings. And this could be due because they are perceived as too technical, a bit like obscure, so they are not understood. And when you combine this resistance with also fragmentation of approaches that can coexist at local implementation level, there is therefore a strong obstacle to scalability. So what I think it's crucial to move beyond pilots. It is to work on one side, standardization, so with the involvement of statistical authorities, public institutions, in order to align methodologies. And on the other side, also work on participation, so involving local stakeholders, citizens, like in the design phases of these instruments, because that, of course, is going to have an impact on the legitimacy that these tools have to the public, and the accountability that they give to the policies which are derived from their implementation.
I think, this accountability is also a thread that goes throughout the day, not only from methodological perspective, but also kind of for topics that sometimes are perceived as new. Of course, they are not new, but they are perceived as new by many people. I think I liked very much what you said several minutes ago about it's a young topic. It's only been around since the 70s. That really underlines, like, especially as we talk about urban planning, these are very, very, very long-lasting structures. These are designing space, designing buildings, whatever. This is something that lasts for centuries sometimes. And when we look at urban centers today, they are built in 1500 something, and they still shape how we move and how we live there. Yeah. So this kind of very long-lasting impacts that we have when making our decisions, I think, is quite a crucial point that might also relate to this kind of resistance. Sometimes that institutions have their ways how they operate, and they have their legal obligations, of course. Do you see kind of some critical points that we need beyond education, for example, to really get these methods into institutional decision making on a daily basis and get it mainstreamed within institutional decision making?
Do you want to start?
Well, so you have mentioned before literacy within the public sector, and I agree that is a fundamental precondition in order to put these innovative methods into real practice. I think I would like to stress that this literacy should be understood as in a broad sense. Of course, we need technical literacy, so we need public administration to be capable of understanding and even using these instruments, but perhaps it could be as equally important also a kind of institutional and political literacy. You have mentioned before it is a matter of political will in order to accept and welcome the insights coming from these methods, from these innovative tools. And so I go back to the importance of a culture of transparent policymaking where evaluation, where accountability are seen as strengths and not as threats, because this is at the end of the day an argument very, very close, very related to political trust. Not just within institutions, but between institutions and citizens. Eventually, these instruments that we design are used to take decisions on the territory and are used to impact people's life. So if they are seen as something imposed from above, of course, they will not be understood and they will not be accepted. But instead, if we can openly discuss them as we are doing today, like we are giving them some visibility and we try to explain them to people probably that can have an impact on how accepted and how welcome they are when it comes to implementation.
Yeah. Maybe I can catch on what you said about political trust and also, I would say, an active role of the people that are not just getting the results of a process, but kind of should be designed as an active component. Because we talked a lot today about indicators, so in the sense that maybe we gave a feeling of something that has to be read, but I think it's very important to have this, to allow this idea of active participation, and also the idea that the support, I mean, in the case of this relationship with territories, the support should not be just a welfarist approach that you just help a territory which is less developed, but it should be like a support. This is what I pushed with my research. It's a support for something that it's actively done in this place. So you recognize this and you try to, if you have public funding, you do it because you recognize this value.
Yeah, I think that another important thing that you both mentioned is the involvement of the public. So, of course, we can decide and think of all the indicators we want and like trying to change the political will and create literacy. But as you were mentioning, like involving people in the action and changing urban planning, but in general speaking, it's crucial, because if you change, and I've seen several times in the practice, if you change spaces thinking that's what population need, but you don't involve them in both the realization of the process but also the maintenance of it, it will just like be abandoned after 1 or 2 months. Mm-hmm. So it's really crucial to have people involved in the process, which is either the design phase or like the development phase or the maintenance one. So.
Yeah, I think that's a topic that also came out through several answers, and we also have, as comments from the audience, kind of something supporting these notions. So, as a comment more than a question, institutions need strong support from leaders and a clear commitment to change, and staff has to be trained how to use new tools, how to understand data. Plus, again, underlining this intersectionality, so different experts from different fields need to work together to understand, because relates back to your point about the SDGs. We cannot think inequalities as in silo. Here is someone that is disadvantaged and here is someone else, but it's overlapping. It's a cross-cutting issue. I would like maybe to one last time come back to data and indicators, as there is a question on it on screen. The question is, this morning we discussed trust in research and institutions, and is there a risk of compromised anonymity or stigmatization with such detailed data that you ask for? Obviously, as it relates to very sensitive parts of people's personalities as well in many cases.
Maybe I can relate on that, bring in an example. Of course, that is one of the challenges that we have when we work with granular data, especially in very small realities. And that is something I have been working on with my colleagues, and for instance, we have some towns in, well, actually villages in Navarra, which they have like 30, 40 residents with an average age of 65, 70 years old. And of course, if you make publish some sensitive data like, income data or other other types of sensitive data in these small realities, that of course creates a conflict between the necessity of collecting really granular data and also the necessity to preserve and protect individuals' privacy and private information.
Do you see it as an issue in particular when it comes to kind of very personal questions as well, of course?
Yeah, absolutely, especially if we think about gender-related issues and discrimination. So, of course, it could be really like produce several other like forms of discrimination. But I think like it's also depends also on how we pose the questions to the data. So to avoid like stigmatization, we could try to see and analyze the data in a different way that avoids that. Like, of course, it's something that we need to keep in mind. And I think also that another important point that was raised today was that data do not describe completely the reality. So of course, they could be as much defined as we want, so as much specific as we want, but they would never be able to describe completely reality. There will be always some shade of like our daily perception and everyday life that would be missing from those data. So like if we depend only on data, we are circling back to some sort of like mathematical understanding of the world, which is what we want to move forward.
Get away from.
Yeah.
Very, very, very good point. Thank you. As we are coming close to the end of our session, I'm not going to ask you for a solution, but rather just propose that we keep that especially in mind, that this kind of data is very sensitive. Sometimes we need to work with it because it helps decision making, but it can, depending on how it is read, depending on how it is understood or published, can be seen as something positive, like for example, helping regions that are facing depopulation, or it can be understood as something critical. If you mention depopulation in small villages, then there is a fear of closing down, and so kind of the message we transmit is very relevant. So with this, I would like to come to an end of our session. Thank you very much to all of you for those reflections and the discussions that you have given. What today's presentations have shown us is that making inequality visible is not just a matter of better data or sharper tools. It's also about kind of rethinking what do we value, who do we listen to, and how do we understand these connections and dependencies that structure our territories. The methods we've seen from your side and also from the other researchers push us to look a little bit beyond what is easy to measure and focus really on what is essential to understand as a guiding principle. And we discussed it, and this reminds us that visibility is something political. What remains unseen in planning is also what remains unaddressed. And by making this kind of invisible visible, we might add a little bit of complexity, but we are in the end creating the conditions for more just and more informed and more place-sensitive policy making. And with this, it's up to me to close the session and this conference, but I hope the conversation on the very important topics continues. Thanks to all the speakers here, thanks to all the speakers today, and also thanks to the audience for your engagement in this session and throughout the day. Thank you and goodbye.